Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chaz Firestone. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Jennifer, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and to all of you for the chance to present some of our work and ideas with you. Like Jennifer mentioned in her introduction, the name of our lab at Johns Hopkins is the Perception and Mind Lab. And the reason for this is that we investigate human visual perception, how we see the world around us. Now, seeing the world might well be the most common and familiar activity of our mental lives. If you just think about what you do with your day, you spend more time seeing the world than you do just about anything, right? You spend more time seeing than talking with your friends. You spend more time seeing than eating, more time seeing than walking around. And so our lab tries to figure out how that process works by asking, how do we see? Now, this is what my collaborators and I think about all day. It's what we basically dedicated our scientific career to understanding. But if you think about this question, there's something that might seem a little bit funny about this, because the question of how we see the world around us might not actually seem like a very difficult or deep scientific puzzle. And in fact, it might seem like it's a question that actually has like a pretty simple and straightforward answer. And the reason for this is that there's a story that we encounter in our scientific and like cultural education that roughly goes like this. What allows us to see objects in the world around us, like for example, this apple, is that there is light in our environment. Maybe the light is from a lamp, or it could be from the sun. And that light hits objects and bounces off of them into our eyes. And it's the fact that light from an object enters our eyes that allows us to become aware of it. Now, the conventional view then is that what we see is a matter of light from objects entering our eyes. And this idea is so ingrained into how we think about vision, and it also just seems so intuitive and so kind of obvious that it can be difficult to imagine how there could be any other answer to the question, how do we see the world around us? But what I want to convince you of today is that this obvious and intuitive idea is actually completely false. And in fact, if there is anything that the science of visual perception has taught us, it's that the objects we see often have only a very tenuous connection to the light reaching our eyes. And that in fact, our visual experience might be better understood as a kind of creation of our own minds and brains, maybe with a little bit of help with the light reaching our eyes. Now, in exploring this theme with you, I'm actually going to take a slightly unusual approach, I think. I'm going to try to convince you of this without showing you almost any scientific data. And that might seem like a bit of an unusual thing to do in a scientific talk hosted by the National Academy of Sciences. But the reason for this is that I have something that is as good or even better, which is that the visual phenomena we are going to experience together are things that you can actually just see for yourself. They're what we call in the psychology of perception, demonstrations. So by showing you some demonstrations and also the occasional graph or chart, you're going to have the chance to see these phenomena for yourself. And many of them are so striking and so compelling that you'll be able to just like appreciate what I'm showing you, even without knowing whether like some subjects in a psychology experiment agree with what you see. So let's get to understanding how what we see might actually go beyond the light reaching our eyes. Now, to warm us up for just getting a feel for how what I'm saying could be true, let's go back to our apple and let's consider a kind of variation on this case that is familiar from everyday life. Suppose that the apple you were looking at was slightly covered, or as we say in psychology, occluded by some other surface, maybe like a picket fence. You've probably had this happen before. Maybe you saw your neighbor through the slats of a fence. When I look at an object like this, I still feel myself have a kind of visual image or experience of the complete apple that is hiding behind the fence, right? I feel my mind kind of stitched together the pieces that are reaching me. And I don't experience like pieces of an apple. I experience a full apple that happens to be partially hidden by a fence. And this already is an example of what we experience kind of coming apart from the light reaching our eyes, right? Because the light coming from our lamp or from the sun is only bouncing off parts of the apple, right? You're only getting information from little apple slices, but you don't have the experience of apple slices. You have the experience of a complete apple behind a fence. Now, this process, which we're going to kind of make a little more interesting as we go along, has a name in the psychology of perception. It's called amodal completion. And this process refers to seeing parts of objects, even when those parts of the objects provide no sensory stimulation of their own. Now, that's what you're experiencing in this case. But you might wonder whether what I'm talking about here is really vision, right? Is really seeing the world, is really perception. And of course, I have the word seeing here in like scare quotes. So maybe I myself am wondering, is this really an example of what we see going beyond the light reaching our eyes? But in fact, psychologists in my field and some work in our lab has done some work to show that the answer to this question of whether this is really seeing is absolutely yes. You are really seeing the apple behind the fence and not just like imagining it or thinking about it. And one of the ways that we know this is that there are cases where amodal completion is so powerful a process that covering something up can actually help us see that thing better. So let's do our first demonstration to kind of get a feel for what this is like. So here's an image that probably looks to you kind of like garbage, right? It doesn't look like much. Maybe it looks like someone took a piece of fabric and like cut it up into a bunch of pieces. Well, what if I told you that actually hiding in this image is actually something very familiar? This is actually a picture of something that you see all the time. You probably saw this thing today multiple times. And to reveal it to you, I'm actually going to cover up part of the image. Okay, so I'm going to add something to this image that's going to block your view. And by blocking your view, I'm going to help you see it better. So here we go. I'm going to add some kind of like paint splotches to this thing. Now, here are the paint splotches. And I wonder if you can now see that this is actually the letter B printed 6 times. There are 6 letter Bs hiding behind these paint splotches. Now, I can't actually see your reactions live, but I have shown this to some other people before, and I myself can experience it right now. And I have some faith that you're able to see what I'm thinking you're seeing here. And of course, this is just the same image, right? Here I've taken away the paint splotches. And if we look at these things side by side, we can pretty clearly see that occluding and obscuring parts of the image are actually helping us to see what that image is a little bit better, right? You can really feel your mind stitching together these B pieces into complete Bs, such that you can see that there are 6 of them. Here's another example. Maybe this looks like most of you to some black rectangles and squares. This is actually a familiar word. Maybe you can kind of piece it together on your own, but let me help you do it better by adding some occluding rectangles, some squares. Now you can see that this is the word little. But again, this is just the same image in both cases. But in one case, we've obscured it and blocked it with something else. So maybe we're beginning to understand how what we see is not just about the light reaching our eyes, and in many cases involves this very interesting contribution of our minds. Now, one thing that you can ask once you kind of accept that this process of amodal completion exists and that your mind is often creating for you some aspects of your visual experience is you can ask, how does my mind know what to put there? Right? How does my mind know what to think is behind these occluding surfaces? And in cases like an apple behind a fence or a familiar letter or word, maybe it's not so mysterious or not so surprising that your mind fills in something that's like kind of familiar. But one very curious thing about amodal completion is that sometimes we can create cases where you will feel your mind create for you something that actually surprises you. Okay, you're going to feel your visual system tell you that the world is a certain way, even though if you were just thinking about it, you might not have thought that the world was that way. Here's an example of what I mean, and this is actually a problem that my lab and I have worked on. So here's a pretty, fairly ordinary picture of some animals. We've got some lions on the left. We have some like elk or moose on the right. And what I'm going to do now is block some part of this image like I've been doing before. But this time I want you to pay attention to the kind of strange way in which your mind is going to engage in some amodal completion. Okay, here we go. So as you can see, I've covered up the head of one of the lions and the derriere of one of the elks. But what do you see? So at least for me, I don't see a head and behind on the other side of this rectangle. If you're like our subjects, what you see is like a really long hybrid strange beast, right? You see this like very weird looking elk lion. And that's very weird, right? Because you know what's really behind this thing. I showed you before. You also have the other row of lions and elks to tell you. But when I cover it up, your mind doesn't seem to care about those things. And it portrays for you this very strange object that you know couldn't really be behind the rectangle. You can actually do something similar and slightly spicier like this. So this is an image of someone you may recognize. This is the actor Daniel Craig, and I think he's looking pretty good in this image. You might recognize him. He played James Bond in some of the James Bond movies like Casino Royale. But some psychologists have treated him in a kind of funny way. What we're going to do now is cover up some parts of Daniel Craig, and you might feel your mind go to a kind of interesting place. So let's cover up Daniel Craig. And this time I won't try to speculate too much on what you're seeing, but what you might find is that your mind doesn't really add the bathing suit, right? You know that he's wearing one, but your mind isn't really doing that. You kind of see him as being naked. And that's pretty surprising too. You know that he's wearing a bathing suit. You know that also people typically wear bathing suits when they're at the beach, but your visual system doesn't seem to care about that. There's no bathing suit evident, and so your mind seems to assume that there isn't one at all, even though, again, these are just the very same images, one with some occluding surfaces, one without. So we are continuing to see how our visual experience of the world is not just about the light reaching our eyes. Now, so far, we've only looked at cases where your mind creates objects for you where you can already see parts of them, right? So in the case of the apple, or in the case of the letter B, you can really see some parts of these objects. Some parts of them really are reflecting light into your eyes. And then your mind is just adding the remaining part. But what about some cases where your mind might actually create new objects that aren't there at all? So a psychologist who's most associated with this idea is the Jewish-Italian psychologist Gaetano Canizza. And he's created a number of these figures. Probably the most famous starts with Pac-Man. So this is a shape that you've seen before. It roughly looks like Pac-Man from those video games. It's just a circle with a chunk taken out of it. And we can have a bunch of them on the screen. So here's Pac-Man with some other Pac-Man friends. And I gather that what you see here are just four shapes, right? Four Pac-Man shapes kind of pointing at each other. Maybe they're about to chase each other around. What Canizza realized is that there are ways to arrange elements in front of you where you can end up with a representation of some object that isn't there at all. So what I'm going to do now is slightly rotate and move these Pac-Man figures around. And I want you to kind of just notice what happens to your visual experience of them. What you should see now is something like this, right? It feels like what you're seeing now is a white square that is on top of four circles, rather than just four Pac-Man that happen to be facing each other, right? That's at least, again, my experience. But again, these are just the same Pac-Man. There is no white square on the screen in front of you. And one way we know that is we can just move the Pac-Man again, right? And when we change their orientation, suddenly we don't see any white squares or anything. We just see four oriented Pac-Man shapes. But again, these are just the same four Pac-Man. We can bring them back and give us the white square. There is a whole inventory of images that do this. So if you change the Pac-Man shapes a bit, you can make yourself see objects that are kind of bendy or convex or concave. It works with other shapes. There are even some cases that work with color. So this is a really interesting one. Hopefully what you're seeing here is you're seeing four bullseyes, and the bullseyes are black, but then there's like this kind of like neon blue film that is a square over all four of them, right? So you maybe see something like this, and I left like a really faint film on the screen for you. But that film, in this case, is not actually there. This is just an image of one of these things, which is, you know, a black bullseye with a neon blue part to it. And it's just four of them. And when the four come together, something kind of magical happens where you now see this like extra neon blue square spreading out over the four things. Okay, so there are also some examples that go beyond 2 dimensions. There are also some ways in which your mind will create objects that look even more real than this. They actually can look like 3-dimensional objects. Here are some really lovely examples from the psychologist Peter Tse. Here's an example of a kind of like sea serpent or Loch Ness monster. And hopefully in this case, what you're seeing is not just do you have a sense of like the fact that the sea serpent is beneath the surface and then above it and beneath it, but it might even feel like you can see the surface it's in itself, right? It almost feels like you can see the water that the sea serpent is in. Maybe this one is even more striking. These are just a bunch of cones, right? Some triangular sections that are arranged in certain ways. But what you might experience here is this kind of like spiky ball, right? It looks like they're on a sphere, even though there's no sphere on the screen in front of you. It's just cones arranged in a certain way. This one might be my favorite. This is just a sort of funny triangle looking thing. But if we get rid of one of the pieces of this thing and then just repeat it a bunch of times, what you end up with here is a kind of like tower or some kind of like obelisk or pagoda maybe that is covered by some ornamental like roof or eave or something like that. And again, these objects are not there at all, right? It's just the clips, it's just the sections of the sea serpent, it's just the cones and triangles, but your mind is inventing objects that are not there at all, and that are certainly not casting any light onto your eyes. Here's a final example from this sort of category of invisible objects. What you see here is probably just a bunch of black and white squares, but if I set these squares into motion, what you might get the sense of is a kind of like 3D cylinder that they're rotating around. So you can now see that they're actually on a certain surface, and that surface has a shape and it seems kind of rigid, and maybe even there's like a front and a back. But all this is some dots moving around on a screen. Your mind is filling in the rest. So we've been seeing how what we see goes beyond the light reaching our eyes and is in many ways a creation of our minds with just some help from the light reaching our eyes. And so far, the phenomena of amodal perception, which includes amodal completion that we've experienced, include the following things. We've seen how occlusion can make us have some amodal perceptual experiences, covering up the apple, covering up the bees, covering up Daniel Craig, this funny hybrid elk lion. We've looked at these cases of what you could call coincidental clipping. So this is cases like the Kanitsa square, or Peter Tsi's serpent and tower, where a chunk of an object is missing in a kind of conspicuous way, almost a suspicious way. And when enough of those things come together, your mind has to like provide the explanation for how that could be. What I want to ask now is whether there's anything else that can cause us to have these amodal experiences. And the reason I'm asking this question is that this is a question our lab has become interested in. And so what I want to tell you about now is a project we have that is trying to discover a new kind of amodal perception, a new case that makes us have an experience of an object that isn't there and is casting no light onto our eyes. And what inspired us to carry out this project, of all things, was mimes. So mimes, in kind of familiar or popular culture, do something pretty intriguing. They can move their body in certain ways that can make you feel like they're interacting with a real object, right? So it might be pulling a rope, it might be leaning on something, it might, canonically like being trapped in a box. And what's really interesting about this case is that if the mime is good enough and the experience is compelling enough, what's making it happen seems pretty different than the cases of amodal completion and amodal perception that we've been looking at so far. So when a mime makes you see a wall, they're not doing it by being partly covered up by a wall. They're not doing it by like having some chunk of their body missing where a wall must be. What they're doing is they're showing you that they're being like physically affected by the wall. And so there's a clue there that we might be able to discover another kind of amodal perception, where if we can create situations where a person or an object is affected by something, is bumped into by something, is supported by something, even though we can't see what that thing is, our minds might kind of create it for us. Now, of course, miming goes beyond just like being trapped in a box. And for all we know, that's actually a bit unfair to mimes, right? There's other stuff involved. There's facial expressions, there's acting. And so to kind of get a purer example of moving your body in ways that imply objects, we were actually more directly inspired by a viral video that it's possible you've seen. But just in case you haven't, I'm going to play it for you here. It's called the Invisible Box Challenge. And I'm actually not going to say much about it. I'll let this clip say it for me.
It's the Invisible Box Challenge, the latest craze sweeping the internet. People look like they're walking on air as they step on top of an invisible box. Many try, most fail. High school cheerleader Ariel Olivar is so skilled, she's considered the #1 invisible box challenger in the USA.
Okay, so that last example from Ariel Olivar, the #1 invisible box challenger in the USA, is the example that I want to focus on. So let's watch that one again. when I see this person do this, I get a very vivid impression of the box that she seems to be supported by. And so this is how we wanted to explore a kind of amodal perception, where what's causing it is a person acting or behaving in a way that seems to show them being affected by some object. Now, the problem is that neither I nor anyone in my lab is good enough at the invisible box challenge. And so we took a slightly different and kind of like higher tech approach. So an undergraduate in my lab named Pat Little, who's now a graduate student at NYU, he convinced me to do something a little bit funny, which is we went to the Hopkins gym and found a padded room and put some objects in it. And he filmed me interacting with these objects. So I'm now going to show you a video that is much less exciting than Ariel Olivar doing the invisible box challenge, but that you'll see is going to be important for the study I want to share with you. So here's this video. It is me stepping on top of a box. And in fact, I have proof it's me. I think I'm wearing the same sweater in this video as I'm wearing right now in front of all of you. I like the sweater a lot. Now, what we did after taking this kind of boring video is we did something kind of exciting to it. We used a machine learning tool that basically simulates a green screen. So we're going to eliminate the background and the box and everything other than me stepping onto something that you can't see. Okay, this is basically what we do now on Zoom with virtual backgrounds, but just a kind of like fancier version of that. And when we apply this tool, what we get is the following. So here I am stepping on a box, and you can't see the box, but at least speaking for myself, I really get a vivid experience, kind of like in the invisible box challenge, that there's something supporting this person's weight. We needed some other videos too. So Pat also convinced me to do something a little more extreme, which is run into a wall pretty fast. And in order to show this video, the condition was that I also show it in slow motion. So here is what it looks like. Mostly I'm just proud of the sacrifices that we make in our lab in the name of science, which you can see I'm making such a sacrifice right now. And we can apply the tool to this video as well. And what we get here is a person running into a wall that you can't see. Okay, so now we have our demo, right? We have some videos where it seems like a person is interacting with an object where you can't see that object, but your mind is kind of creating it for you. And this time we really wanted to do an experiment. So we had to come up with a way to kind of measure or find some way to indicate that the people we showed this video to really are experiencing a box or a wall, or at least that they can kind of tell that that's what's going on. And so to measure this, we were actually inspired by a very old finding in psychology that it's possible you've heard of before. It's called the Stroop effect, and it's nearly 100 years old. It's named the Stroop effect because it was discovered by someone named Stroop. And here's how the Stroop effect works. So what I'm going to do in a moment, this is going to be a detour that will help us understand the experiment that we did with invisible boxes and walls, is what I'm going to do now is show you some text. Okay, and the text is going to be printed in colored ink. And what I want you to do in your home is just say out loud in the room that you're in, you don't need to unmute yourself or anything, but just wherever you are, maybe you're with someone, just maybe you're alone, say out loud the color of the ink of the text that I show you. Okay, so you're going to see it's going to be sort of strings of text. It's going to be text, 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 text. And every time a piece of text appears, you have to say the color that it's printed in. Okay, so we're going to start off pretty easy, and I'm going to do this with you, but then I'll kind of let you do it on your own. So here's what it looks like. Red, green, blue, yellow, red, blue. Okay, now I'm going to make things a little bit more interesting. So this time the text is going to say some words, but forget about the words. Your job is just to name the color of the text. Okay, so let's try that. Okay, so hopefully that was pretty easy too, but you might now have a sense of where I'm going with this. So now I'm going to make things a little more difficult, and there's going to be some other words, but again, forget about the words, just name the color of the text. So here we go with that. Now, probably this last one felt a little bit different, okay? Probably when there was this mismatch, you found it harder to name the color of the text than when everything matched really nice. And why does that happen? Well, this is something that you can experience not just on your own, but it's also something that we would discover if we ran this as like a laboratory experiment. So if we were to record the reaction time of people saying green, red, blue, yellow, and so on, what we would find is that they're slower to say the color of the text when there's this mismatch between the color and the word than when there's a match. Okay, so like if this were a graph of response time, lower is better, right? Lower means faster. And what we would find, and what people do find when they run this experiment in the lab, is that you're faster in the match case than in the mismatch case. And this is interesting for a few reasons, but the reason I'm interested in it for our invisible box challenge purposes is that a finding like this tells us something very interesting about the two processes involved. It tells us that at least one of them is automatic, okay? By which I mean that it tells us that there's something going on that you can't help but do. And in this case, it's reading the words. So in other words, when you do this task, and especially when you're in that like hard version of the task, you're probably thinking to yourself, darn, if only I could just turn off my reading brain, this would be really easy, right? If only I could just not read the words that are printed in front of me, I would have a pretty easy time doing this. But the reason that you still have a hard time doing it is that you can't turn off the reading part of your brain. Reading text is automatic. And the way we know that is that it's interfering with your ability to do something else in a way that you can't help. So now the question is, can we show that the experience of the wall when the man runs into the wall is similarly automatic? And so the way that we did this was very directly inspired by the Stroop effect. What we did is, after we played the video of the person running into the wall, we made a line appear on the screen, okay? And we gave subjects an extremely simple task, about as simple as naming the color of some text. We just asked them, what's the orientation of the line? Is it a horizontal line or is it a vertical line? And they just have to answer this as quickly as possible. But what we then do is like mix and match the video of the wall and the box with a horizontal line and a vertical line. And here's what that looks like. So I'm going to loop through a bunch of the images or displays and videos that subjects in our experiment saw. And you could try to kind of like play along, okay? So imagine that you were a subject in this experiment and you had a keyboard in front of you and you just had to press a key for vertical or press a key for horizontal, or forget even the keyboard. You could just say it out loud again like you did with the Stroop effect. Just say vertical, say horizontal, and see if you can feel the frustration for yourself. See if you can feel how it's kind of annoying when you see a certain interaction and then the wrong thing appears. It kind of gets in the way of your ability to report the orientation of the line. Okay, so we actually ran an experiment using this, this design. And normally the way that we would run one of these experiments is we would have people come into our lab and we would have them look at this thing and we would have them make some responses. And who knows, we might even do some other fancy things to them, like measure what their brain looks like when they're looking at it. But we actually ran some of these experiments during the pandemic. And in COVID times, you can't do this for very good reasons. We couldn't bring subjects into our lab. So we actually did something that is becoming increasingly common in psychology, which is we programmed a web page. And we actually had hundreds of people across the country complete our experiment, basically like from the comfort of their own home. In fact, you could do this yourself, actually, and I'm going to show you how to do it later. And so we made this web page, and this is a kind of screenshot from the web page. The subject will have seen a bunch of instructions. There's going to be a man, there's going to be a line. Before the line appears, the man will move around. Don't worry about the man, though. All you have to do is tell us whether the line that you see is vertical or horizontal, right? Is flat or upright. And so here's what it would feel like or look like to be a subject in one of these experiments. You would see the man run, you would see the line, you would press a key, and then you would get some feedback. You were wrong, right? Oh, in this case, you were right. And you would keep going, and you can see there's like a little progress bar where this person does several dozen of these trials. And by the end, we have a sense of which conditions were easy for them and which were hard. And in this one, the person is actually too slow. And that's important because we also made sure these judgments were speeded. So we told people, you have to respond very quickly. And by making them respond very quickly, we're giving ourselves the best chance to find this kind of increase or decrease in the speed of their responses. So if this is the design of our experiment, right, where we have two kinds of videos, and then after each video, there can be two kinds of lines, what we want to know is, just like in the Stroop effect, are you faster to report the orientation of the line when it matches the orientation of the surface that's implied by the actor's behavior than when it doesn't, okay? And in fact, that's exactly what we found. So this is kind of just like the toy graph I showed you with the Stroop effect, where lower is better. You're faster to say that a vertical line is vertical and that a horizontal line is horizontal if you just saw a person run into a wall, or if you just saw a person step onto a box. And you're slower if there's a mismatch between them. So just like in the Stroop effect, this seems to suggest a kind of automaticity, right? If you're in this experiment and maybe you kind of already got a taste of it, just like in the reading case, you might find yourself thinking, ugh, I wish I could just not pay attention to this guy. I wish I could just not realize that he's running into a wall or stepping onto a box. But you can't not realize that, right? You can't turn off the part of your brain that is making you become aware of this surface. And the reason we know that is that even, many minutes in, even after doing this dozens of times, we still find that the surface implied by the person's behavior is interfering with the people's ability to respond to the line. Now, we have some other experiments on this phenomenon. One thing that we were actually a little bit worried about is that there could be an alternative explanation to the findings I just shared with you. So as I described them, I was saying that this is kind of like a mime, right? Or kind of like the invisible box challenge, where the reason you're seeing this wall or this box is because of the physics of the interaction, right? The man is bouncing off the wall, and it could only be a wall that he's bouncing off of. And so that's why you see the wall, at least according to how I was talking about it. But there's another possibility. So one thing you might notice in this video is that in order for this man, right, in order for me to run into a wall, I had to become like deformed by the wall, right? I had to become vertical. My body became vertical in order to bounce off the wall. And if my body became vertical, and then you got better at detecting a vertical line, then it could be that what was going on all this time is not that you got better at detecting the line because of the wall that was implied by the actor's behavior. It could be that just like there's more vertical stuff in the video, right? A vertical person. And it's not like that in the box case. So maybe you just saw some more vertical lines and that made you be better at seeing vertical lines later. So to rule that out, what we would need is a collision that involves like rigid objects that are not going to deform. And so we can program that. So we did that next. We had a ball basically bounce off of something that you couldn't see and it doesn't change its shape. And then we would either say, hey, check out this line. Is it a diagonal line or a horizontal line? And so we can create like the same loop that we made with the person and the wall and the box. We can have a disk bounce off an oblique line. We can have it bounce off a horizontal line. It can bounce straight back up. It can bounce off to the side. And just like before, we can have this design where there's two kinds of interactions, bouncing up and down and bouncing to the side. And then there's two kinds of lines, an oblique line and a horizontal line. And when we do this, we get the same result. So people are faster to say that a diagonal line is diagonal if they first see a ball bounce off of nothing in such a way that the nothing actually has to be an oblique line, and vice versa when it doesn't match. We have even more experiments that do this. So one of our sets of experiments involves actually looking at two things at the same time. And your goal now is to say which side the line appears on. And this can be important for certain reasons that you can ask me about, but that I might not have time to go into here. But we find the same effects in these cases. And we're even interested in some other phenomena. So you've heard of a mime in a box by now, but have you ever seen discs bouncing around in a box? This is something that we think is actually another similar phenomenon. So if you stare at this thing long enough, you get a pretty vivid sense of the shape of the container that the discs are in. And if you stare really long enough, who knows, maybe that container might actually appear before your eyes. So earlier on in this talk, I asked whether the sources of amodal perception go beyond these kinds of classical cases of covering stuff up or cutting off objects in the right way. And here I've suggested that the answer is yes. You can actually also kind of see invisible objects by other things interacting with them, not just things covering them up or being sort of deleted by them. And so this has all been an example of how what we see really does go beyond the light reaching our eyes. This is not really the right way to think about perception, as we've seen in these various demonstrations. Your mind is stitching together little snapshots that it gets. It's inferring what's behind occluders. Sometimes it's creating entirely new objects when other things seem to be covered up by those. And in some cases, discs bouncing around or a person being supported by a box can also make you kind of have a visual impression of these objects. And so this is why I describe our visual experience as being better characterized as a kind of creation of our minds with some help from the light reaching our eyes. Now, before I end, I just want to point to a few other ideas and resources that you might be interested in if you want to learn more about this. So first, even though I and my lab created some of the images and displays that I showed you, many of the things I've shown you have come from other researchers, and a list of all of those references is here. So if you want to learn more about any of the phenomena that I've shown you, you could try to find these papers, or you could email me and I could send them to you. Some of these are links. And this would be a way to see and also read more about amodal completion, amodal perception, occlusion, and all of these sorts of things. The experiments that I told you about involving running into a wall and stepping onto a box are published. And if you want to read more about those, you can actually read the paper that reports all of this in much more detail than I had time to go to here, including some other experiments. We've also made this available at a website that's really easy to go to. It's just perceptionresearch.org/mime, which was, after all, the inspiration for our studies. If you go there, you will find a link to the paper right away, and you could download it and read it. Another thing that you'll see if you go to this website is you'll see that we've done something that adheres to a principle that our lab is pretty excited about, which are called principles of open science. So something that we care quite a bit about is making sure that whenever we run some study, the fruits of that study are available to the general public. So if you go to this website, you'll be able to not only read the paper, but you'll also be able to download the code that we use to run the experiments. You'll be able to download the videos that we use to create these images that you saw. You'll also be able to download the actual data from the subjects who ran in our experiments in their homes. They've been made anonymous, so you can't tell who these people are, but you can see what they did. And this is all to say that if you're ever wanting to learn more about this or even run some of your own experiments, you'll have the chance to do so. Finally, I'd like to thank some people. So I'd like to thank my collaborator, Patrick Little, who joined our lab as an undergraduate and, as I mentioned, is now completing a PhD. And I'd also like to thank the rest of my lab. I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation, who funded much of this research and is a wonderful organization. But really, this is true. They really invest in not only science, but in scientists. And the amount of trust that the NSF puts into our lab to do our work is something I really appreciate. I'd also like to thank my lab. They really keep this whole thing going. And finally, I'd like to thank you, both this talk series for hosting me, and also you, the audience, for listening to what I had to say. So thank you very much.